Hello, everybody. I'm Felix Wemheuer, professor for modern China studies at the University of Cologne. And this is my YouTube channel, Studying Maoist China. But today I will make an exception. We will not talk about Maoist China, but about Xinjiang. So my distinguished guest today is Björn Alpermann, who is a professor for contemporary Chinese studies at Würzburg University. So hello, Björn.
Hi, Felix.
Yes, thanks for joining us. And today we want to talk about this book. It's published in German, Xinjiang, China und die Uiguren. But I think the topic is so important that we also want to reach an English audience because I think today every China scholar is often asked, what do you think about Xinjiang? So Björn is an expert for contemporary Chinese society, and among his many publications, I just want to name some: China's cotton industry, economic transformation and state capacity. It's published with Routledge in 2010. And also with Routledge in 2011 was published Politics and Markets in Rural China. Important in this context is also that Björn published several papers on birth planning and population development in China. And just to name one of his latest publications, he's a guest editor of a special issue of the Journal for Current Chinese Affairs on urban and rural transformation in China. But now let's talk about Xinjiang. So when I try to check sources of Western media reports about Xinjiang and also footnotes of scholarly articles, it seems that Adrian Zenz is the most important and influential reference. Zenz is based at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C., that could be described as a right-wing think tank. However, today we want not to talk about his political and religious background, but about his claims and the use of sources. He estimated that a total of 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities had been extrajudicially detained in Xinjiang, and he described this as the largest incarceration of ethno-religious minorities since the Holocaust. His estimate of over 1 million people in camps played an extremely important role that Western media began to accuse the Chinese government of genocide, and several governments finally enforced sanctions against China. So here's my first question to you, Björn. Zenz built his argument mostly on official Chinese internet sources and some classified documents. By writing your own book, you checked the footnotes of Zenz's article. How do you evaluate his claims about these camps and his estimation about the number of people in the camps? What methods do you use to check sources at a time when meaningful field studies are not possible anymore on sensitive topics in Xinjiang?
Yeah. Well, it's a very relevant question. Let me start by saying that we really owe Adrian Zenz a great deal of our knowledge on what's happening in Xinjiang. And I really appreciate how he has been very innovative in the sources that he found and how he used it, the methodology that he developed. So we can really say that his work has advanced the field a great deal. However, when it comes to certain details, especially in respect to interpretations of certain documents, I sometimes beg to differ in my book, as we can also discuss later on in more detail. Now, checking sources on the topic of Xinjiang is unfortunately not always possible. I mean, Adrian Zenz has done a lot to archive internet sources on the web, so you can actually check the original Chinese texts, which is very helpful. But not all of the sources are openly available. So what you can do, however, is to corroborate or try to corroborate the information using different sources, and that's what I would do in such cases. Try to find other sources that support or correct other people's interpretations. And with respect to the camps, we have a range of sources. We have not just census reports, we have eyewitness statements, we have satellite footage, we have leaked documents from the Chinese government. So we have a fairly wide range of different sources that help us to triangulate the findings. Generally speaking, I think what we need to confront here is it's similar to a statistical survey, where you would always want to know, how has the sampling been conducted? Was it really randomized? What might be the drawbacks of the methodology? And also whether the results are significant. And you need to discuss these issues in social science in order to know how confident you can really be with respect to the findings. And that's what I try to do in my book, always discussing how reliable are the findings. And when you do that, you can see that some findings, some allegations are better founded, are better evidenced, better supported by evidence, and others less so. Now, with respect to the number of camp inmates, Zenz first calculated only the holding capacity of newly constructed camps. So he was looking at the tenders, the public tenders put out by local governments in Xinjiang, and calculated how many inmates could be held in these cells. Now, the actual number of inmates might differ from that holding capacity for obvious reasons, right? They could be less if they are not used up to capacity, or they could be more if in between people are being released or transferred to other facilities. So it's one indication, but it's not really a hard and fast figure. And in another paper, he was using food subsidies as a way to estimate how many actual inmates are being held in these facilities. And with that, he arrived at this roundabout figure of 1.8 million. But he himself says that this is only a speculative number. Yeah, so we have to keep in mind that this is a workaround. It's not. It's hard to confirm this with other sources. So it's a ballpark figure, I would say. But in the end, to my mind at least, it doesn't really matter whether it's 800,000 or 1 million. Yeah, we know that there has been a massive incarceration program going on.
Yeah. But I think for the NGOs and the campaigns, it was very important to establish this number of 1 million or more, and then also the media using this number. So Zenz also argues that the government would push Uyghurs into programs of forced labor on a massive scale, especially in the cotton industry in Xinjiang and also in factories on the Chinese East Coast. Some NGOs call for a boycott or sanction against firms which are using cotton from Xinjiang for the product. Zenz considers an academic study of Nankai University from 2018 as a proof that the Chinese government would use programs of labor transfer to reduce the density of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. You also can download this paper on his website. The Chinese government presents the labor transfers as part of a great attempt to reduce rural poverty in Xinjiang. What is the rationale behind these programs? Does Zenz provide enough evidence to claim this would be a form of forced labor?
Yeah, well, the so-called Nankai report, as Zenz calls it, I think can be read in two different ways. Certainly, it argues that there should be increases and a more regularized transfer of laborers from southern Xinjiang to the east of China, mostly in manufacturing. The goal behind this, it's quite clearly stated, is at first cultural assimilation, cultural transformation of the Uyghurs, and also poverty alleviation. So these two goals are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in glove, basically. And the Uyghurs in these programs are to be turned into docile industry workers. So that's pretty obvious. They should shed their previous so-called backwards agricultural producers' life and enter modern industries. But the Nankai report also specifically argues that security agencies in the east of China should not treat the Uyghurs merely as a potential danger and all treat them as extremists or even dangerous terrorists. In fact, that would run counter to the intention of transforming them into industrial workforce and integrating them into Han mainstream society. So the report is quite critical with respect to local governments in Eastern China, and especially the security forces there, because they discriminate against Uyghurs in that way. And this is something that I think does not come out in Zenz's work quite as clearly yet. The goal of diluting the Uyghur population density in southern Xinjiang in particular is actually more clearly stated in a range of academic sources that Zenz also cites and that you will also find cited in my book. These academic reports were often written by demographers or sometimes also security specialists working on Xinjiang. And the ideas behind this population dilution are actually quite old. You can find precursors of that in the Qing dynasty, where there was also this idea that if you bring in more Han Chinese to this region, or even Hui for that matter, then we would stabilize the region for the empire. So what I see is different now is that the current party state is much more determined and also more capable in putting this into in reality and carrying out such a program. Now, with respect to the overall assessment of forced or coercive labor, I would say that there are different degrees of force or compulsion involved in these programs. And it's always difficult from the outside to really determine how much compulsion is being used. And I personally always differentiate between programs that employ so-called graduates from the re-education camps, where I'm very certain that we can speak of this only in terms of coercive labor. But with the poverty alleviation programs, I'm not so sure. I think it's really hard to establish that all of this is only due to compulsion. In my book, I'm a bit more reluctant to use that term. I speak of political mobilization. That's certainly happening, but whether that amounts to a legal definition of coercive labor, I'm having my doubts.
Yeah, and you have worked on a cotton industry before, so why is the cotton industry such a big issue in this context?
Yeah, well, China is a huge cotton producer, and within China, most cotton is being grown in Xinjiang. This cotton industry, especially the harvesting, has used lots of labor inputs actually from other parts of China, Sichuan and other places that exported in the 2000s, hundreds of thousands of seasonal harvest workers who would come to Han Chinese, who would come to Xinjiang to pick the cotton. And you find a report by the Uyghur Human Rights Project from 2017, where this is decried as robbing Uyghurs of their chance to be employed in the cotton sector. Now the government has turned to Uyghur laborers, mobilizing them to pick the cotton instead of the Han migrants from other places of China. And of course, this is now also being claimed to be a form of forced labor. Again, I'm not 100% convinced. There is an element of political mobilization, and there is, if you don't participate in these programs, you might be labeled extremist because you refuse to partake in the modern economy. But we haven't seen very reliable proof of that in the form of, let's say, a leaked document. We have that for birth control, something we're going to talk about later, where we see from the Karkash list, for instance, that people who have violated birth restrictions have been put into the camps. We don't have the same kind of proof for forced labor, that if you refuse a job assignment, that you would be put into a camp. So still, I'm having some reservations because poverty alleviation is obviously the stated goal and by the government, and would also be a very reasonable goal. And we have these claims by Uyghur human rights activists from earlier years that they would have liked Uyghurs to participate in cotton picking more. So that somewhat attenuates these allegations, I would say.
Yeah, so let's talk about the issue of birth planning. In one of his papers, Zenz argues that the introduction of the strict two-child policies for non-Han people in Xinjiang since 2017 would be a demographic campaign of genocide. He claims that the birth rates of Uyghur women declined massively in the following years. Why did the Chinese government end preferential policies for minorities in relation to birth planning? In your book, you compare different sets of population data from Xinjiang. What are your findings?
First of all, I think it's important to say that Zenz is using official Chinese data. So he didn't make up any data. It's really the official data that you find in relevant national level yearbooks. And they do show that birth rates in Uyghur-dominated, but also Kazakh-dominated counties and prefectures in Xinjiang have dropped dramatically, very steeply over the past couple of years. And not even the Chinese government is denying that, but it's providing different reasons for that. So the Chinese authorities are saying this is because of their successful developmental policies. It's because of rising incomes, rising educational attainment, especially among women, and also because of urbanization. Now, all of these factors are known to affect birth rates, but only in the longer term. So they, in my opinion, they cannot explain such a rapid and a steep drop in fertility. And therefore, I treat this as not really convincing. The second thing is that, as you mentioned, there are different sets of data available, both at the national and the provincial level, and they don't really match. Yeah, it's a common problem with Chinese data that different sources provide different statistics. Long story short, these two sets of data tell slightly different stories in terms of how locally focused these efforts are. When you look at the provincial level data, which is more disaggregated, it appears that the efforts to restrict birth rates is more locally focused on, for instance, Khotan and other places, including also Kazakh dominated places, not just Uyghur majority places. But there are certain discrepancies between the two sets of data that you cannot simply resolve. Yeah, they're just there. In this case, I rather try to inform the readers that you have these discrepancies, whereas Zenz is building his paper only on one set of data and gives a neater story, a less complex picture. But I would say, in order to be fully informed, you need to see the full picture. And you asked why did they end the preferential treatment? Ostensibly, it's because they now want to treat all the ethnic groups in the same way. So within a certain locality, no matter what ethnic group you belong to, you have one set of rules. So it's 2 children for urban couples in Xinjiang and 3 children for rural couples for the time period we're talking about. However, I have myself some speculation about why they might have made this big push in Xinjiang, especially using sterilizations, which is a long-term measure to prevent birth. Namely, that the Chinese authorities might have had a view to the upcoming census in 2020, and that they might have envisaged that they have to switch to a 3-child policy across the board in China, which they now did, and that they wanted to create facts on the ground before they did so to restrict Uyghur families and Kazakh families and other minority families at the level of 2 children, and then enforce sterilization. But I admit that's only speculative. I don't have any further evidence to back that up.
Yeah, so this is my last question. In your book, you argue that the term genocide is not useful to describe the development in Xinjiang because there's hardly any evidence that the Chinese government has the intent to destroy the Uyghur population physically. However, you argue that cultural genocide would be useful to label the big pressure for assimilation with the Han Chinese. For example, you list the massive reduction of minority language classes in schools and universities, the destruction of mosques, graveyard, and Uyghur architecture in old parts of the city and even inside people's homes. Since years, some Chinese intellectuals argue that the Soviet-style affirmative action policy towards ethnic minorities backfired and resulted in an increase of ethnic conflicts in the 1990s. Hence, they call to abolish ethnic classification, preferential policies, and local autonomy that comes with it. Since 1949, the policy of the CCP towards ethnic minorities flip-flopped between a moderate tolerance of minority culture, religion, and languages, and policies of forceful assimilation, such as during the Cultural Revolution. Regarding Uyghurs and Tibetans, neither the hard line nor the soft line was successful in the past to curb local nationalism. Could forceful assimilation work this time because the Chinese state has much more resources than in the past?
Yeah, let me start with a genocide question. There is a really complex legal debate on the definition of genocide, which I also detail in my book. Briefly put, in order to come to the conclusion that genocide is happening, you need to prove that there is the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic group, in this case, an ethnic group, as such. And that is a necessary requirement to legally speak of genocide. Now, several leading experts in international law testified in front of the German Bundestag, the German parliament, and its Human Rights Committee in May this year. And they came to the conclusion that this is not evidenced in the case of Xinjiang. And instead, some suggested that it would make more sense to classify what is happening in Xinjiang as crimes against humanity, a different legal concept that, according to these legal experts, seem to be more appropriate. That is basically the reason why I reject this label as genocide, because it's quite intricate legal debate. You can read up on that in my book. Now, some might say that my use of the term cultural genocide is a kind of an understatement, is making light of what's happening in Xinjiang. So I anticipate this this criticism. Because the qualifier cultural could be seen to label it as a lesser evil, so to say. But in my view, it actually adds precision to what we're observing in Xinjiang, because the target really is this cultural transformation that I was mentioning before. It's a top-down enforced cultural transformation that is supposed to happen in a very short time span. And it's really getting rid of a lot of what Uyghur culture and other minority cultures as well stand for. So I think that what the critics of my stance of cultural genocide have in mind is more that cultural genocide is not a legal category. It's not part of the 1948 Genocide Convention. So it doesn't give you a lot of legal purchase, a lot of legal leverage. But that doesn't mean it's incorrect as an assessment. Yeah. So people who are arguing for the genocide, to recognize it as a genocide, usually do so because they want to have a better vantage point from which to criticize and to punish the Chinese government. Now, with respect to whether they can be successful or not, I'm not so sure, at least not yet. Obviously, China is investing tremendous resources into Xinjiang to incorporate it very firmly into the PRC. and it's investing a lot of effort in transforming the minorities, ethnic groups there, and to assimilate them to the Han Chinese mainstream. But we have seen that periods such as this, the Cultural Revolution, 10 years, was not enough to eliminate Uyghur or other ethnic cultures in Xinjiang. You might even say it's more like 20 years from the late 1950s to the late 1970s that minority cultures were repressed in Xinjiang. And nevertheless, you have a resurgence in the 1980s and 1990s. And if you go back a little bit further in history, even under the Qing, you would see that there have been similar phases. They certainly leave a trauma, I would say that. So then they don't pass without any traces, obviously, but that doesn't mean that in the future we wouldn't see a resurgence maybe of minority cultures.
Yeah. I think on the one hand, there's a Soviet model, right, of ethnic labeling and local autonomy and affirmative action policies. And then you have this kind of concept of assimilation. So maybe we also can say that now the CCP policies toward ethnic minorities are moving more closer to a kind of a Kuomintang concept from the 1930s. And also in Xinjiang, right, there are still Uyghur language publication and music, and there are also still minority language classes, even as a number is of these classes is reduced. So I can hardly imagine that then the Chinese government will abolish the slogan of the China 55 ethnic minorities and Han Chinese. So
I agree. That's part of the Zhonghua Minzu narrative, the Chinese nation consisting of these various ethnic groups. So they cannot outright abolish it, but they are debasing the ethnic minority cultures and kind of sanitizing and hanifying what's left standing after the assimilation campaign.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it's a very controversial issue. We have to also keep on with the debate. And I also like to say that your book can be downloaded, open access from the website. So Björn, thanks a lot. Yeah, and goodbye.
Thank you.